Her ex mocked her for having no lawyer. Until a millionaire boss arrived and stunned the entire court. Sophie's hands trembled as she gripped the stack of wrinkled papers in her lap, her knuckles turning white under the harsh fluorescent lights of courtroom B. The wooden bench beneath her felt hard and unforgiving, much like the stares from the other people present. She could feel their judgment weighing heavily on her shoulders as Tom, looking perfectly polished in his expensive suit, continued his verbal assault. "Your Honor," Tom said, his voice dripping with mock concern, "Ms. Williams can't even afford proper legal representation. How can she possibly handle the responsibilities we're discussing here?" He gestured toward Sophie with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Look at her. She's barely keeping herself together." Sophie's chest tightened as whispers rippled through the courtroom. She recognized several faces from their old social circle, people who used to smile warmly at her at parties and gatherings. Now they sat behind Tom, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. "Furthermore," Tom continued, straightening his silk tie, "she's working as a mere assistant, living paycheck to paycheck. After her mother's passing, she's proven herself completely incapable of maintaining any semblance of financial stability." The mention of her mother sent a sharp pain through Sophie's heart. It had only been 3 months since the funeral, and the wound was still raw. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. She wouldn't give Tom the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The papers in her hands were copies of bank statements, carefully organized receipts, and detailed notes she'd prepared for her defense. She'd spent countless nights at her small kitchen table, poring over documents, trying to build a case she could present on her own. But now, sitting here, everything she'd prepared seemed woefully inadequate. "I mean, really?" Tom's voice took on an almost gleeful tone. "She shows up here without a lawyer, carrying a bunch of papers like she's presenting a middle school project. It's almost amusing, if it weren't so pathetic." A few chuckles emerged from Tom's supporters. Sophie's face burned with humiliation, and she found herself shrinking further into her seat. The judge's expression remained neutral, but Sophie could swear she saw a flicker of agreement in his eyes. "My client," Tom's lawyer chimed in, his voice smooth and practiced, "has legitimate concerns about Ms. Williams's capability to handle matters of this magnitude. Her current situation speaks volumes about her decision-making abilities." Sophie wanted to stand up, to defend herself, to tell them about the hours she worked, about how she'd been saving every penny possible while paying off her mother's medical bills. She wanted to explain that she wasn't choosing to go without a lawyer. She simply couldn't afford one, but her throat felt tight, and the words wouldn't come. Tom's smirk grew wider as he noticed her distress. "I think it's clear to everyone present that Ms. Williams is in over her head. She can barely keep herself afloat, let alone manage anything more complex." The judge glanced at his watch and cleared his throat. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his gavel striking with a finality that made Sophie flinch. "We'll resume afterward to hear Ms. Williams's response." As people began to file out of the courtroom, Sophie remained seated, her fingers still clutching her papers. Tom walked past her, deliberately bumping against her shoulder. "Good luck with your little presentation," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Finally, when most people had left, Sophie forced herself to stand on shaky legs. She moved to a corner of the courtroom, leaning against the wall for support. The papers in her hands suddenly felt meaningless, just pieces of paper that couldn't possibly stand up against Tom's legal team and their polished arguments. Her eyes burned as she stared at the floor, questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. How had she convinced herself she could do this alone? The weight of her situation pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. In just 15 minutes, she would have to stand before everyone and somehow defend herself. But right now, she couldn't even find the strength to lift her head. Sophie slumped against the cold marble wall outside the courtroom, her hands still trembling from Tom's verbal assault. The 15-minute recess felt both too long and too short. She dreaded going back inside, but couldn't see how hiding in the hallway would help either. Her phone buzzed in her purse, making her jump. Fumbling with the zipper, she pulled it out, expecting another concerned message from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had been checking on her since her mother's passing. Instead, she saw Evan's name on the screen. Her boss rarely texted, preferring email for work communication. Her stomach knotted as she opened the message. "Sophie, please meet me at Carter's Cafe after your court appearance today. Important to discuss something. Evan." She read the message 3 times, her anxiety climbing. Was something wrong at work? Had she made mistakes in her distraction over the court case? The timing couldn't be worse. She needed this job more than ever. "Perfect," she muttered, sliding down the wall until she sat on the cold floor, not caring about wrinkling her carefully pressed skirt. Just perfect. A group of people walked past, their shoes clicking against the marble floor. She recognized them as Tom's friends, their whispers and sidelong glances making her skin crawl. One woman, wearing designer heels that probably cost more than Sophie's monthly rent, actually pointed at her. Sophie pushed herself up, brushing off her skirt with shaking hands. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her on the floor. Her mother had always said dignity was free, even when everything else came with a price tag. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Evan. "Don't worry about rushing. I'll wait." The kindness in those simple words made her throat tight. Evan had always been considerate, even if their relationship was strictly professional. She remembered how he'd given her time off, without question, when her mother's condition worsened, how he'd sent flowers to the funeral, even though they'd only worked together for 6 months. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. 2 minutes, he announced to the scattered groups in the hallway. Sophie took a deep breath, smoothing her hair and straightening her shoulders. She watched Tom's supporters file back into the courtroom, their confidence a stark contrast to her uncertainty. Her own support section consisted of empty benches. She hadn't wanted to burden anyone with this mess. As she gathered her papers, her phone felt heavy in her pocket, Evan's text like a tiny lifeline. At least someone wanted to talk to her, even if it might be about work problems. It was more than she had right now. The judge's stern face appeared in her mind, along with Tom's smirk. She had to go back in there, had to face them all again. But now she had something after, a reason to keep going, even if just for another hour. Carter's Cafe was only 2 blocks away, and they made good coffee. She could hold on to that thought. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked back into the courtroom, each step feeling like lead. Tom was already seated with his lawyer, both of them shuffling papers with practiced importance. The judge hadn't returned yet, and the low murmur of conversations filled the room. Sophie slid into her seat, alone at her table. She arranged her papers one more time, though she knew it was pointless. The evidence was solid, but without a lawyer to present it properly, it might as well have been blank pages. Still, as she sat there waiting for the judge, she felt a tiny spark of something other than despair. Maybe it was the thought of coffee at Carter's, or maybe it was knowing that someone, even if just her boss, wanted to talk to her. It wasn't much, but right now, it was enough to keep her from running out of the courthouse entirely. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and everyone rose to their feet. Sophie's heart pounded as she stood, but she held on to that small spark of hope like a shield against what was to come. Sophie absently stirred her untouched cappuccino, watching the foam swirl into abstract patterns. Carter's Cafe hummed with the usual afternoon crowd. Students with laptops, business people taking late lunches, baristas calling out orders. The familiar atmosphere usually soothed her, but today it felt like background noise to her racing thoughts. She checked her phone again. 2:47 p.m. Evan had said he'd meet her at 3 o'clock. She'd arrived early, unable to stand waiting anywhere near the courthouse after the morning's humiliation. Her hands still trembled slightly when she thought about Tom's smug face, his lawyer's practiced condescension. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Sophie's head snapped up. Evan stepped inside, his tall frame commanding attention even in casual business attire. He carried himself with the same quiet authority he showed at the office, but something about his expression made her stomach clench. She'd never seen him look quite so intense. "Sophie." He nodded as he approached her table, shrugging off his suit jacket before taking the seat across from her. His movements were deliberate, measured, like someone preparing to deliver significant news. "Mr. Crawford," she started, then corrected herself. "Evan, thank you for meeting me." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth. "I hope I haven't kept you from anything important." "Nothing more important than this." His voice was gentle but firm. He studied her face for a moment, then gestured to the waitress. "Could I get a black coffee, please? And perhaps my colleague would like a fresh cappuccino?" He glanced pointedly at her cold drink. Sophie started to protest, but Evan held up a hand. "Please, allow me." The waitress swept away their old cups, and Sophie found herself smoothing her skirt under the table, a nervous habit her mother had always teased her about. Evan's calm demeanor usually put her at ease at work, but right now it just heightened her anxiety. "How did court go this morning?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. Sophie's throat tightened. "It was—" She swallowed hard. "Not great. Tom's lawyer is very experienced, and Tom himself—" She stopped, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like whining. "Tell me everything," Evan said, leaning forward slightly. "From the beginning." Their fresh drinks arrived, and Sophie wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, drawing comfort from its solidity. She took a deep breath and began explaining how Tom had manipulated their shared accounts before leaving, how he'd managed to make it look like she'd mishandled their joint investments, how his family's connections had helped him build a case against her. "I have documentation," she added quickly, "proving what really happened, but without a lawyer—" She shrugged helplessly. "The judge barely looks at anything I present." Evan listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. He hadn't touched his coffee, and his stillness made Sophie increasingly nervous. When she finally ran out of words, he remained silent for a long moment. "I see." He straightened in his chair, adjusting his tie in a gesture she recognized from important meetings. "Well, that simplifies things." Sophie blinked. "Simplifies? I'll be representing you in court." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You need a lawyer. I am a lawyer. I'll be representing you." But you're my boss," Sophie stammered. "You run a successful business. You can't possibly—" "I maintained my law license," Evan said calmly, as if they were discussing the weather. "And while I haven't practiced regularly in recent years, I assure you I'm more than qualified to handle this case." Sophie's mind reeled. Her boss, her successful, wealthy boss, was offering to be her lawyer? It made no sense. "I don't understand," she managed. "Why would you want to get involved in this mess?" Guardian Angel Evan's expression softened as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the cafe table. The afternoon sun streaming through the window cast shadows across his face, highlighting the slight creases around his eyes. signs of concern Sophie had never noticed before. "The truth is, Sophie," he began, his voice low and measured, "I've been following your case since the beginning." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "Actually, I've been keeping an eye on you since before that, since your mother passed away." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The mention of her mother sent a familiar ache through her chest, but confusion quickly overshadowed it. "What do you mean, keeping an eye on me?" "Your mother, Patricia, and I were old friends," Evan explained, his eyes distant with memory. "We worked together at Harrison and Mills, back when I was still practicing law full-time. She was one of the finest paralegals I've ever known." Sophie's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "Mom never mentioned—" "She wouldn't have," Evan said gently. "We lost touch after I left the firm to start my own business. But when I heard about her illness—" He cleared his throat. "I visited her in the hospital, about a week before she passed. She was worried about you, about leaving you alone to face everything." Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. She remembered those final days clearly, the sterile hospital room, the beeping machines, her mother's increasingly fragile voice. But she had no memory of Evan visiting. "I came after hours," he continued, as if reading her thoughts. "She made me promise to look out for you, in whatever way I could. That's why I created the position at my company, the one you interviewed for." Sophie's mind raced back to that interview. She'd been desperate for work, drowning in medical bills and grief. The job had seemed like a miracle, above her experience level, with excellent pay and benefits. "You mean, I didn't actually earn that position?" "No," Evan said firmly, leaning forward. "You absolutely earned it. I may have ensured your resume made it to the top of the pile, but your qualifications and interview performance got you the job. I wouldn't have hired you otherwise. That wouldn't have helped anyone." Sophie sat back, processing this information. All these months she'd thought it was just luck or fate that had brought her to Crawford Enterprises. Instead, it had been Evan, quietly watching over her, keeping his promise to her mother. "When Tom filed his lawsuit," Evan continued, "I had my legal team monitor the proceedings. I wanted to step in sooner, but He hesitated. "I thought you might want to handle it independently. You're very much like your mother that way, determined to stand on your own feet." A tear slipped down Sophie's cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, but Evan had already noticed. He pulled a crisp handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "But after today's hearing," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "it's clear that Tom and his lawyers are playing dirty. They're taking advantage of your lack of representation, and I won't stand by and watch them destroy everything you've worked for." Sophie clutched the handkerchief, overwhelmed by the revelation. Her boss, this successful, powerful man, had been her silent guardian all along. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Why would he go to such lengths? What did he really want from her? "I don't know what to say," she whispered, staring at the elaborate monogram on the handkerchief's corner. It's too much. I can't possibly accept." "You can and you will," Evan said, his tone brooking no argument. "I made a promise to Patricia, and I intend to keep it. But more than that." His expression softened again. "You deserve better than what Tom and his lawyers are trying to do to you. Let me help." Sophie looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motives, any sign that this was too good to be true. But all she saw was sincerity in his steady gaze, and something else, a warmth that made her heart flutter uncertainly. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Evan's office, casting a warm glow over the polished mahogany conference table. Sophie sat rigidly in her chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Evan spread out several folders, his movements precise and methodical. "First," he said, pulling out a document and sliding it toward her. We need to address Tom's claims about your shared assets. His voice was calm and steady, completely different from his usual business tone. He's trying to paint you as financially irresponsible, but I've gone through your records. Sophie glanced at the paper, recognizing her bank statements and transaction history. I kept everything, she said quietly. Every receipt, every bill. Which was incredibly smart, Evan nodded approvingly. These records show a pattern of Tom systematically draining your joint accounts, not you. He pulled out another document. And here's where it gets interesting. I had my team track the money trail. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes widening as Evan explained. The numbers told a story she hadn't fully understood before, how Tom had gradually moved their shared funds into private accounts, leaving her with mounting bills and dwindling resources. But that's not even the strongest part of our case, Evan continued, reaching for another folder. Tom's family law firm has a history of similar tactics. They've been involved in at least 3 other cases where they've used financial pressure to force settlements. How did you find all this? Sophie asked, amazed at the depth of information. I still have connections in the legal world, Evan replied, a slight smile playing at his lips. And Tom's firm isn't as careful as they think they are. He paused, his expression growing serious. Sophie, I need you to understand something. This won't be easy. Tom and his lawyers will fight dirty when they realize I'm involved. Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. I'm ready. Good, Evan said, pulling out more documents. Because we're not just playing defense anymore. We're going to expose their pattern of misconduct. I've already filed motions to subpoena their records from those other cases. For the next hour, Evan walked her through his strategy. He explained legal terms in ways she could understand, showed her the evidence they'd present, and outlined how they'd counter Tom's accusations. With each explanation, Sophie felt her confidence growing. There's one more thing, Evan said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. These are copies of emails between Tom and his father's firm, discussing their strategy against you. Notice the dates. Sophie's hands trembled as she read the emails. These are from before we even separated, she whispered. He was planning this all along? Yes, Evan confirmed, his jaw tightening. They were setting you up, creating a paper trail they could use against you, but they never expected anyone to find these emails. How did you get them? Let's just say I have friends in their IT department who owed me a favor. Evan gathered the documents back into his briefcase. Are you ready to face them? Sophie took a deep breath, straightening in her chair. For the first time since this legal nightmare began, she felt like she had solid ground beneath her feet. Yes, I think I am. They arrived at the courthouse early, the morning crowd still thin. Sophie watched as Evan organized his briefcase, each document in its precise place. He moved with the confidence of someone who had fought and won countless battles in these halls. As they waited outside the courtroom, Sophie noticed how different Evan looked in his court attire. Sharp, focused, almost predatory. Gone was the gentle businessman who had comforted her yesterday. In his place stood a seasoned lawyer, ready for battle. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and Sophie caught sight of Tom and his legal team already seated at their table. They looked smug, probably still thinking she was representing herself. Evan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as they walked in, his touch conveying silent support. The courtroom fell silent as Evan rose from his seat, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Sophie watched as he approached the witness stand, where Tom's first witness, their former financial advisor, sat nervously adjusting his tie. Mr. Peterson, Evan began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed room. You testified earlier that Mrs. Walker, my client, was, and I quote, reckless with joint finances. I'd like to explore that statement. Tom shifted in his chair, his earlier smugness wavering as Evan pulled out a thick folder. "Could you explain these transactions?" Evan held up a document. "Specifically, the series of transfers made on March 15th of last year?" The financial advisor squinted at the paper. "Those appear to be standard account movements." "Standard?" Evan's eyebrow arched. "Is it standard practice to move substantial sums to offshore accounts without both account holders' knowledge?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Tom's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning goes directly to the witness's credibility and the heart of our case," Evan smoothly interjected. "I have documentation showing Mr. Peterson facilitated these transfers under Mr. Thompson's sole direction, despite the accounts being joint property." The judge studied the papers Evan presented. "Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Crawford." Sophie watched in amazement as Evan methodically dismantled the financial advisor's testimony. He produced email after email, document after document, each revealing a carefully orchestrated pattern of financial manipulation. "And these signatures?" Evan held up another set of papers. "Could you explain why there are discrepancies between Ms. Walker's signatures on these transfer authorizations?" The witness paled. I would need to review—" "Allow me to help," Evan interrupted, producing an enlarged comparison of the signatures. "Our forensic expert has already reviewed them. Would you like to revise your earlier testimony about Ms. Walker's involvement in these transactions?" Tom's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He whispered frantically to his lawyer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Evan continued his surgical precision, moving from witness to witness. When Tom's sister took the stand to testify about Sophie's supposed spending habits, Evan produced credit card statements showing it was actually Tom who had made the excessive purchases. "Miss Thompson," Evan said, his tone deceptively gentle, "could you explain why you claimed my client purchased these items when the security footage clearly shows your brother making these transactions?" The sister stammered, looking to Tom for help. But there was none to be found. Sophie could hardly believe the transformation. The same courtroom that had felt so oppressive earlier now crackled with a different energy. Even the judge was paying closer attention, taking detailed notes as Evan presented evidence after evidence. "Your Honor," Evan said, standing tall, "I would like to submit these additional documents into evidence. They demonstrate a clear pattern of systematic financial abuse and manipulation by Mr. Thompson and his family's firm." Tom's lawyer scrambled to object, but Evan was prepared for every argument. He cited precedents, referenced statutes, and presented everything with such clarity that even Sophie could follow the legal complexities. As Evan returned to their table, Sophie noticed how the other spectators in the courtroom were looking at her differently now. The whispers had changed from pity to admiration. The judge's earlier skepticism had been replaced by focused attention. But it was Tom's face that told the real story. Gone was the arrogant smirk, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He kept staring at Evan as if seeing a ghost, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table before him. The judge called for a brief recess, and as people began to move, Sophie caught Tom's eye. For the first time since their separation, she saw fear there. Real fear. He quickly looked away, huddling with his legal team in urgent conversation. Beside her, Evan calmly organized his notes, seemingly unaffected by the chaos he'd just created. Sophie wanted to thank him, to express her gratitude, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, she sat there, watching as her former tormentor's carefully constructed case crumbled before her eyes. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as people filed out of the building. Sophie's legs felt wobbly from sitting tense for hours during Evan's masterful dismantling of Tom's case. She gathered her belongings, still processing the dramatic shift in her fortunes. "Sophie," Evan's voice was soft but urgent. "Would you walk with me?" She nodded, following him down the marble hallway. Their footsteps echoed against the walls as they moved away from the dispersing crowd. Evan led her to a quiet alcove near an old wooden bench, away from curious eyes and listening ears. "There's something you need to know," he said, loosening his tie slightly. "My involvement in your case, it's not just about helping you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She studied his face, noting the subtle lines of worry that hadn't been there during his confident courtroom performance. 15 years ago, Evan began, his voice dropping even lower. "I was involved in a case that nearly destroyed my career. It involved Thompson Industries, Tom's family company." Sophie sank onto the bench, her bag sliding to the floor. "What kind of case?" Evan joined her, keeping enough distance to maintain professionalism, but close enough for private conversation. "I discovered irregular financial patterns, similar to what Tom's doing to you now. But back then, it was on a much larger scale. Corporate fraud that affected hundreds of people." His hands clasped together, knuckles whitening slightly. "I was young, ambitious, and thought I could take on one of the city's most powerful families. I had evidence, solid evidence, of their wrongdoing." "What happened?" Sophie asked, noticing how Evan's usual composure wavered slightly. "They buried me." His jaw tightened. "Used their connections to discredit my evidence, painted me as a desperate lawyer trying to make a name for himself. They even fabricated evidence suggesting I was the one attempting fraud." Sophie's eyes widened. "But you're still practicing law." "Barely survived the investigation. My reputation took years to rebuild." Evan stood, pacing the small space. "The only reason I wasn't disbarred was because one key witness, someone inside Thompson Industries, refused to lie about my involvement. They couldn't prove their accusations without that testimony." Understanding dawned on Sophie. "That's why you knew exactly where to look for evidence against Tom. You've seen their tactics before." Evan nodded grimly. "The Thompsons have a pattern. They haven't changed their methods, just gotten better at hiding them. When I saw what Tom was doing to you..." He paused, emotion flickering across his face. "I couldn't stand by and watch another person's life be destroyed by their greed." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Sophie asked, trying to process this new information. "I needed to be sure I could help without my past compromising your case. The Thompsons don't know I'm involved yet. They were too busy underestimating you." Evan's expression softened. "But they'll figure it out soon, and when they do, they'll come after you again," Sophie finished, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." Evan met her eyes. "I'm not telling you this to worry you, Sophie. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what we're up against. The Thompsons won't just fight dirty. They'll try to destroy anyone who threatens their interests." Sophie sat in stunned silence, the weight of Evan's revelation settling over her. The man she'd known as her composed, successful boss had been carrying this burden all along, watching history repeat itself through her own struggles with Tom. The courthouse had grown quiet around them, most people having left for the day. Through the windows, the sun had sunk lower, casting the alcove in deeper shadows. The air felt heavy with unspoken implications of what this meant for both of them. The morning after Evan's revelation, Sophie arrived at the office earlier than usual. Her mind was still processing everything she'd learned about Evan's history with the Thompsons. The office was quiet, with only the gentle hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. She found a fresh cup of coffee waiting on her desk, steam still rising from the surface. Next to it was a small note in Evan's precise handwriting. "Thought you could use this after yesterday." Sophie wrapped her hands around the warm cup, noticing he'd prepared it exactly how she liked it. 1 sugar, splash of cream. She couldn't remember ever telling him her coffee preference. Throughout the morning, she caught herself watching Evan through the glass walls of his office. He moved with the same confidence he always had, but now she saw something else. A weariness in his shoulders when he thought no one was looking, the way his hand occasionally reached up to massage his temple. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a text from him. "Don't forget to eat lunch. The Jensen case files can wait." Sophie realized she'd been so absorbed in work, she'd lost track of time. It wasn't the first time he'd reminded her to take care of herself, but now these small gestures carried new weight. Later that afternoon, during a particularly frustrating call with opposing counsel, Evan appeared at her desk with a cup of chamomile tea. He didn't say anything, just placed it beside her and gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze before walking away. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through her. "You're handling this beautifully," he said after the call ended, leaning against her desk. "Don't let them rattle you." His presence was steadying, and Sophie found herself drawing strength from his quiet confidence in her. She noticed how his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, the way his voice softened when speaking just to her. When a courier delivered more files from Tom's lawyers, another attempt to overwhelm them with paperwork, Evan helped her sort through them, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed documents back and forth. Each accidental touch sent a flutter through her stomach that she tried to ignore. "We'll get through this together," he assured her, his voice warm and certain. The word "together" lingered in her mind long after he'd returned to his office. That evening, as most of the staff headed home, Evan stuck his head out of his office. "You should call it a day, Sophie. You've done enough." "Just a few more minutes," she replied, not looking up from her computer. Instead of returning to his office, he walked over and gently closed her laptop. "The work will be here tomorrow. You need rest." She looked up, ready to protest, but the concern in his eyes made her pause. He was standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and woodsy that made her think of autumn walks and crackling fires. "I'll drive you home," he offered. "It's getting dark." Sophie wanted to decline, to maintain some professional distance, but found herself nodding instead. During the drive, she noticed how he kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, how his hand twitched toward hers when she mentioned her fears about the case. Outside her apartment building, he waited until she was safely inside before driving away. Sophie stood in her entryway, her heart beating faster than it should. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, her phone lit up with one last message from Evan. "You're stronger than you know. Sweet dreams, Sophie." She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the message. These feelings growing inside her were dangerous. He was her boss, her lawyer, and now she knew he carried his own complicated history with her case. She needed to focus on winning against Tom, on rebuilding her life. She couldn't afford to be distracted by the way Evan made her feel safe, understood, and cared for. But as she lay in bed, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of his hand on her shoulder, the gentleness in his voice, the way he seemed to anticipate what she needed before she knew herself. Despite her best efforts to push these thoughts aside, they followed her into her dreams, where the line between professional gratitude and something deeper grew increasingly blurry. The courtroom felt smaller today, more confining. Sophie sat rigidly in her chair as Tom's new lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, approached the witness stand. Her former co-worker, Sarah, looking uncomfortable, twisted her hands in her lap. "Ms. Jenkins, would you say Ms. Porter was unstable during her employment?" The lawyer's voice dripped with false concern. Sophie's stomach clenched. She felt Evan shift beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers in silent support. Well... Sarah glanced at Sophie apologetically. She was emotional sometimes, especially after her mother passed. Tom smirked from his seat, and Sophie's cheeks burned. She'd confided in Sarah during those dark days, sharing her grief over coffee breaks. Now those private moments were being twisted into weapons. And did these emotional episodes interfere with her work performance? Objection. Leading the witness, Evan stated calmly, his voice carrying across the courtroom. Sustained, the judge replied. But Tom's lawyer pressed on, redirecting. Can you describe Ms. Porter's behavior in the office? Sarah fidgeted. She cried in the bathroom sometimes, and there was that day she left early. Because her mother had just died, Sophie whispered, her nails digging into her palms. Evan's hand covered hers briefly, stopping her from breaking skin. And did she ever discuss her financial difficulties with you? Tom's lawyer continued. Objection? Relevance? Evan stood, his presence commanding attention. Your Honor, we're establishing a pattern of instability and poor judgment that directly relates to the case at hand. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, the judge warned. Sophie watched as more of her private struggles were aired like dirty laundry. Tom sat there, radiating smug satisfaction as his lawyer painted her as emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, and attention-seeking. In fact, the lawyer continued, producing a stack of papers, we have documentation of several late rent payments, missed credit card bills, and a defaulted student loan. Sophie's vision blurred. Those struggles had come during her mother's illness, when she'd poured every spare penny into medical treatments. She felt exposed, humiliated. But Evan remained steady beside her. She noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the careful way he maintained his composure. When he stood for cross-examination, his voice was measured, almost gentle. Ms. Jenkins, you mentioned Ms. Porter's emotional moments. During this time, was she caring for a terminally ill parent? Yes, Sarah answered softly. While working full-time? Yes. And despite these personal challenges, did she maintain her professional responsibilities? She did. Sophie never missed a deadline. Evan nodded, then turned to address the financial documents. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C, Ms. Porter's complete financial records, including documentation of medical expenses that consumed her savings during her mother's illness. Sophie watched as Evan methodically dismantled the attack on her character, transforming her struggles into evidence of her resilience. But she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hand, as he held up documents. During a brief recess, she caught him rubbing his temples, his face drawn. When he noticed her watching, he quickly straightened up, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Evan, she started, concerned. I'm fine, he said quietly, but she saw how his fingers tightened around his water glass. Tom's voice carried across the courtroom as he spoke to his lawyer, loud enough to be heard. Keep pushing. Everyone knows what that old scandal did to him. He can't handle the pressure anymore. Sophie's heart clenched as she watched Evan's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He maintained his composed exterior, but she could see the cost of this battle in the shadows under his eyes, in the way his hand shook slightly as he organized their files. When court resumed, Tom's lawyer launched into another aggressive line of questioning, this time targeting Sophie's relationship with Tom during their time together. With each personal detail exposed, each private moment dissected, she felt herself shrinking. But it was watching Evan absorb each blow, standing as her shield while carrying his own wounds, that truly hurt her heart. Sophie found Evan in his office after hours, silhouetted against the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His usual confident posture was absent, replaced by a weariness she'd never seen before. You should go home, get some rest, he said without turning around. Not until you tell me what's really going on. Sophie's voice was gentle but firm. I saw your face today when Tom's lawyer mentioned the Morrison case. Evan's shoulders tensed. He was quiet for so long that Sophie thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to his desk, pulling out an old newspaper clipping from a drawer. 15 years ago, I was handling a major corporate fraud case, he began, his voice low. The evidence pointed to serious wrongdoing by Westcorp Industries, Tom's family company. Sophie settled into one of the leather chairs, watching as Evan's fingers traced the yellowed headline, Star Lawyer Evan Matthews Faces Ethics Investigation. I had everything documented. Witness statements, paper trails, digital records. He gave a bitter laugh. What I didn't have was protection against their influence. They got to my key witness, convinced him to change his testimony. Then they planted false evidence suggesting I had fabricated documents. Sophie's breath caught. But that's illegal. It is. But they covered their tracks well. Evan finally turned to face her, his eyes reflecting years of buried pain. The ethics board cleared me eventually, but the damage was done. My reputation was in tatters. Major firms wouldn't touch me. I had to rebuild from scratch. He walked to a small side table and poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to Sophie. Tom's father, Richard, was the mastermind behind it all. He knew exactly how to manipulate the system, who to bribe, which strings to pull. Sophie watched as Evan's hand tightened around his glass. When I saw your case file, saw Tom's name, I knew I couldn't stand by. The same tactics his father used, the character assassination, the manipulation of evidence. Tom's using them against you. That's why you stepped in, Sophie whispered, understanding dawning. Partly? Evan set his glass down carefully. But it's more than that. I saw how hard you worked, how you refused to give up even when everything seemed stacked against you. You reminded me of myself before. He gestured to the newspaper clipping. The difference is, you're not alone, Sophie said firmly. A ghost of a smile touched Evan's lips. No, I suppose I'm not. He sat heavily in his chair. But watching Tom use his family's playbook, seeing how they're trying to paint you as unstable, unreliable, it brings it all back. The shame, the helplessness, the anger. Sophie moved to perch on the edge of his desk, closer to him. You're not that person anymore, Evan. You're stronger now, wiser. Maybe. He looked up at her, vulnerability clear in his eyes. But every time I step into that courtroom, I wonder if they'll succeed again, if they'll find some way to twist the truth, to make everything I've rebuilt come crashing down. They won't, Sophie said with quiet conviction. Because this time you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, and you're not fighting alone. Evan studied her face for a long moment. You know, when your mother was sick, she asked me to look out for you. I promised her I would. I never expected. He trailed off, emotion thick in his voice. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. Never expected what? Never expected you to be the one giving me strength, he admitted softly. Your resilience, your integrity, it reminds me why I became a lawyer in the first place. To fight for what's right, no matter the cost. They sat in companionable silence, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows like distant stars. Sophie looked at this man who had risked so much for her, who had carried his wounds silently for years while helping others fight their battles. She felt a deep surge of admiration and gratitude, mixed with something warmer she wasn't quite ready to name. Thank you, she said simply, for trusting me with this. Evan's response was equally quiet. Thank you for making me believe in justice again. Sophie watched Evan from across the conference room, her concern growing with each passing minute. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually pristine suit jacket was slightly wrinkled. He hadn't stopped working since dawn, poring over case files and legal documents. "Evan, maybe we should take a break," Sophie suggested, placing a fresh cup of coffee beside him. He barely looked up, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "Just need to finish this motion," he muttered, reaching for the coffee without taking his eyes off the screen. "Tom's lawyer filed new evidence yesterday. I need to review everything before court." Sophie's stomach twisted with guilt. Ever since Evan had confessed about his past with Tom's family, he'd been working twice as hard. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the coffee cup, how he winced when he turned his neck too quickly. In the courtroom that afternoon, the signs of exhaustion became more apparent. Evan's normally fluid movements were stiff, his responses to objections a fraction slower than usual. Tom's lawyer, sensing weakness, pressed harder. "Your Honor," Tom's lawyer said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Perhaps Mr. Matthews needs a moment to collect himself? He seems distracted." Evan straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I'm fine, Your Honor. Please continue." Sophie watched as he pulled another file from his briefcase, his hands shaking slightly. She wanted to help, to shoulder some of his burden, but she felt helpless. This was her battle, yet Evan was fighting it as if his own life depended on it. The afternoon wore on, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to rise with each passing hour. Evan's face grew increasingly pale, but his voice remained steady as he cross-examined Tom's expert witness. "Mr. Peterson," Evan said, approaching the witness stand, "you claim that my client's financial records show inconsistencies, yet these same records were verified by 3 independent accountants. How do you explain—" Sophie saw it happening before anyone else. Evan's steps faltered, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the podium. The papers in his other hand scattered across the floor as his knees buckled. "Evan!" Sophie was out of her seat before she could think, rushing to his side. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. "Order!" The judge's gavel cracked through the chaos. "Mr. Matthews, are you all right?" Evan had caught himself before fully collapsing, but his face was ashen. Sophie's arm was around his waist, supporting him as he swayed slightly. "I apologize, Your Honor," Evan managed, his voice strained. "Just a moment of dizziness." "This court will take a 30-minute recess," the judge announced, concern evident in her tone. "Mr. Matthews, I suggest you use this time to rest." As bailiffs cleared the courtroom, Sophie helped Evan to a nearby chair. Her hands shook as she loosened his tie and pressed a cold water bottle into his hands. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she whispered, fighting back tears. "This isn't worth your health." Evan took a slow sip of water, some color returning to his face. "You're worth it, Sophie. This case, it's about more than just you and Tom. It's about stopping this family from destroying another person's life." "Not at the cost of your own," Sophie insisted, kneeling beside his chair. She could see the exhaustion etched in every line of his face, the weight of both past and present battles wearing him down. Through the courtroom windows, afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the floor. The empty gallery seemed to echo with the day's tensions. Sophie noticed how Evan's hands were still trembling slightly, how his breathing wasn't quite steady. "Let me help you," she pleaded softly. "You don't have to carry this alone." Evan closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment, Sophie saw the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. The mighty lawyer, the protective guardian, was just a man who had been fighting for so long he'd forgotten how to stop. The clock on the wall ticked steadily towards the end of their recess, each second bringing them closer to returning to the battlefield. But for now, in this quiet moment, Sophie stayed beside Evan, sharing his burden in the only way she could. Sophie watched as Evan straightened his tie, his hands still slightly unsteady. The courthouse hallway was quiet now, most people having left for the day. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. "I'm fine, really," Evan insisted, though the pallor of his face told a different story. "Just needed a moment to catch my breath." Sophie crossed her arms, unconvinced. "You nearly collapsed in there, Evan. That's not fine by any definition." He managed a weak smile, reaching for his briefcase. "It's nothing some rest won't fix. I've handled worse pressure before." "That's what worries me," Sophie said softly. She noticed how he winced slightly when bending to pick up some scattered papers. "You're acting like this is just another day at the office, but I can see what it's doing to you." Evan paused, his shoulders tensing. "Sophie, I appreciate your concern, but—" "No," she interrupted, surprising both of them with her firmness. "You've been taking care of me since this whole thing started. Let me return the favor, at least a little bit." The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Sophie could see the internal struggle playing across Evan's face, the desire to maintain his composed exterior warring with obvious exhaustion. "When was the last time you ate something proper?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the way he avoided her gaze. "And I don't mean those protein bars you keep in your desk." "I had," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his silver hair. "I honestly can't remember." Sophie picked up her purse. Decision made. "That's what I thought. Come on, we're getting dinner." "Sophie, there's still work to be done. The briefs for tomorrow—" "We'll still be there after you've had a proper meal?" she finished firmly. "You taught me that taking care of myself wasn't optional. The same goes for you." Something in her tone must have reached him, because his resistance crumbled. "All right," he conceded with a small smile. "Lead the way." They ended up at a quiet Italian restaurant a few blocks from the courthouse. Sophie watched as Evan slowly relaxed, the tension in his shoulders easing as they settled into their booth. "When did you become so good at taking charge?" he asked, genuine warmth in his voice. Sophie stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I had a good teacher, someone who showed me that strength isn't about handling everything alone." The waiter brought their food, and Sophie noticed how Evan's hands shook slightly as he picked up his fork. She pretended not to see, knowing his pride, but her mind was already working. "You know," she said carefully, "I may not be able to help with the legal stuff, but I could help organize the case files, take notes during interviews, handle the administrative side of things." Evan looked up from his pasta, surprise crossing his features. "Sophie, you already have your regular work duties. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering," she interrupted gently. "Let me help, Evan. Please." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Sophie met his gaze steadily, letting him see her determination. "All right," he finally said, his voice soft. "We'll figure out a system tomorrow." Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they continued their meal, she noticed more color returning to Evan's face, his movements becoming steadier. The restaurant's warm lighting cast a gentle glow over their table, and Sophie found herself studying the man across from her. Beyond the powerful lawyer, beyond her protective boss, she saw someone who had been carrying heavy burdens alone for far too long. She might not be able to fight his legal battles, but she could do this. She could remind him that he wasn't alone anymore. As they finished their meal, Sophie was already planning ways to lighten his load, organizing his schedule to include actual breaks, ensuring he ate regular meals, maybe even convincing him to delegate some of his regular cases to other lawyers at the firm. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in their connection. A deepening of trust, a strengthening of bonds forged in shared battles. They both knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges in the courtroom, but for now, in this moment, they had found a different kind of victory. The courtroom's air felt thick with tension as Tom's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, approached the judge's bench with a stack of documents. Sophie's stomach tightened as she watched his confident stride, the slight smirk on his face making her blood run cold. "Your Honor," Peterson began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I'd like to present new evidence that has recently come to light." He gestured toward the clerk, who began distributing copies to both the judge and Evan. Sophie glanced at Evan, trying to read his expression as he received the papers. His face remained carefully neutral, but she noticed the slight tightening around his eyes as he scanned the first page. "These documents," Peterson continued, "show a pattern of behavior that directly contradicts Ms. Thompson's earlier testimony." He paused for effect, his eyes sweeping the courtroom. "We have evidence of multiple instances where the plaintiff has demonstrated questionable judgment and financial irresponsibility." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. She watched as the judge flipped through the pages, her expression growing more serious with each turn. "Furthermore," Peterson pressed on, "we have witness statements that suggest Ms. Thompson's claims about my client's behavior are greatly exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated." Evan stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor, we object to the late introduction of this evidence. The defense had ample time to present these documents during discovery." "The documents only recently came into our possession," Peterson countered smoothly. "We're presenting them at the earliest possible opportunity." The judge adjusted her glasses, studying the papers before her. "I'll allow it, Mr. Harrison, but I'm giving you time to review and respond to these allegations. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." Sophie felt the room spin slightly. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself as whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. She could feel Tom's satisfied gaze boring into her from across the room. When she finally found the courage to look up, she saw him leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that familiar smug expression she'd grown to hate. He caught her eye and smiled, a cold, calculating thing that made her skin crawl. Evan gathered their materials quickly, his movements precise and controlled. "Let's go," he murmured, placing a steadying hand on Sophie's elbow as she stood on shaky legs. They made their way through the courthouse corridors in silence, Sophie's heels clicking against the marble floor in an irregular rhythm that matched her racing thoughts. Evan guided them to a small, empty conference room, closing the door behind them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sophie sank into one of the chairs, her legs finally giving out. Evan remained standing, spreading the new documents across the table, his expression growing darker as he examined each page. "How bad is it?" Sophie whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. Evan didn't respond immediately, his fingers drumming against the table as he read. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. "They've been thorough," he finally said, his voice low. "They've gathered statements from former colleagues, old roommates, even your college advisors." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare display of frustration. "They're trying to paint a picture of instability, of someone who can't be trusted." Sophie felt tears threatening to fall, but blinked them back. "But it's not true," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. Evan looked at her then, his eyes softening. "No, it's not true, but they've constructed their narrative carefully. They're trying to undermine your credibility, make the judge question everything you've testified to so far." The weight of potential defeat pressed down on Sophie's shoulders. She could feel the progress they'd made slipping away, like sand through her fingers. All their hard work, all the late nights and careful preparation seemed to crumble in the face of these new allegations. "I can't lose this case, Evan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't let him win." Evan moved closer, pulling a chair beside her. "Listen to me, Sophie," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is a setback, yes, but it's not the end. We're going to fight this, every single piece of it. We'll work through the night if we have to, but we're not giving up." Sophie met his gaze, drawing strength from the determination she saw there. The fear was still present, hovering at the edges of her consciousness, but Evan's unwavering support acted as an anchor, keeping her grounded. They sat in shared silence, both acutely aware of the battle ahead, but united in their resolve to face it together. Sophie stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her tiny apartment, barely recognizing the exhausted woman who looked back at her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her normally neat appearance seemed disheveled despite her best efforts. Her hands trembled as she tried to fix her hair for the third time that morning. The weight of the case pressed down on her like a physical burden. She'd barely slept last night, tossing and turning as Tom's smug face and Peterson's damning evidence played on repeat in her mind. Her stomach churned, refusing the toast she'd forced down earlier. Her phone buzzed on the counter, another message from Evan checking in. He'd been doing that more frequently lately, especially after yesterday's devastating court session. Sophie couldn't bring herself to reply. The guilt of dragging him into this mess, watching him exhaust himself for her cause, was becoming unbearable. A wave of dizziness hit her, and she gripped the edge of the sink. "Pull yourself together," she whispered to her reflection, but the words felt hollow. The strong, determined woman who had first walked into that courtroom felt like a stranger now. The doorbell rang, startling her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, she saw Evan standing there, concern etched on his face. Sophie considered pretending she wasn't home, but knew he wouldn't believe it. "Sophie?" His voice carried through the door. "I know you're in there. Please let me in." With a shaky breath, she opened the door. Evan took one look at her, and his expression softened. "You haven't been answering your phone." "I'm sorry," she managed, stepping back to let him in. I needed some time." Evan followed her into the small living room, taking in the scattered case files and half-empty coffee cups. "You've been reviewing the evidence all night, haven't you?" Sophie sank onto her couch, suddenly too tired to keep up appearances. "I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I close my eyes, I see more ways this could all fall apart." Her voice cracked. "Maybe Tom was right. Maybe I'm not strong enough for this." "Stop." Evan's voice was gentle but firm. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Look at me, Sophie." She reluctantly met his gaze, surprised by the intensity she found there. "You are not weak," he said. "You've faced every challenge head-on. You've stood up to Tom's intimidation, to Peterson's accusations, to the whispers and judgment. That takes incredible strength." "But I'm falling apart," she whispered. "I can barely eat, barely sleep. Yesterday in court, I almost had a panic attack when Peterson started reading those statements." "That's not weakness," Evan countered. "That's being human. You're feeling the pressure because you care, because this matters to you, but you're not alone in this fight." Sophie felt tears welling up. "I never wanted to burden you with all of this. You've already done so much—" "Listen to me carefully," Evan interrupted, taking her hands in his. They were warm and steady, anchoring her. "I'm not here out of obligation or pity. I'm here because I believe in you, in this case, in what we're fighting for." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "When I first took this case, yes, it was about helping you win against Tom. But it's become something more than that." Sophie's breath caught at the tenderness in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I'm not just fighting for your freedom from Tom's accusations," Evan said softly. "I'm fighting for a future where you never have to feel weak again, where you can walk into any room with your head held high, knowing your own worth." The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I don't know if I can be that person." "You already are," Evan assured her. "You just need to believe it as much as I do." The courthouse hallway buzzed with whispered conversations as Sophie made her way to the water fountain. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing in the high-ceilinged space. The morning's proceedings had been particularly tense, with Tom's lawyer becoming increasingly aggressive in his questioning. As she bent to take a sip, a familiar voice made her freeze. Well, if it isn't the damsel in distress with her knight in shining armor. Tom's words dripped with mockery. He stood a few feet away, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Sophie straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "What do you want, Tom?" "Just thought you should know what kind of man you're really working with." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. "Did your precious Evan tell you everything about the Morrison case? About how many lives he ruined?" Sophie's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "I know enough." "Do you?" Tom's smile widened. "Because I have some very interesting documents here. Emails, actually. The kind that could make headlines." He held up his phone, showing her a screen full of text. "Would be a shame if these found their way to the press." "That's blackmail," Sophie said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her shaking hands. "No, sweetheart. That's insurance." Tom stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tell Evan to back off, or everyone will know exactly what kind of man is defending you. Every dirty detail." Before Sophie could respond, a heavy hand landed on Tom's shoulder. Evan stood there, his presence commanding even in silence. "Is there a problem here?" Evan's tone was calm, but his eyes were steel. Tom shrugged off Evan's hand. "Just having a friendly chat with my ex, reminiscing about old times." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Evan, check your email. I sent you a little preview of what's coming." Sophie watched Tom walk away, her stomach in knots. She turned to Evan, who was already pulling out his phone. "Evan, I'm so sorry. He just... Don't apologize for him," Evan said firmly, his eyes scanning his screen. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What is it? What did he send?" Evan looked up, his expression carefully controlled. "Nothing I wasn't expecting. Tom's family has been sitting on these documents for years. But if they release them, then we'll deal with it." Evan pocketed his phone. "Come on, we need to get back to court." But Sophie couldn't move. The weight of what was happening, of what Tom might do to Evan's reputation, felt crushing. "This isn't right. You shouldn't have to sacrifice everything just to help me." Evan turned back to her, his expression softening. "Sophie, listen to me. Tom thinks he can scare us with these threats because that's how he operates, through fear and intimidation. But he's wrong." "But your reputation..." "My reputation survived the first scandal. It will survive this too." He stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "I knew exactly what I was getting into when I took this case. Tom's family has been holding these documents over my head for years, thinking they could control me with them." Sophie searched his face. "Then why risk it all now? For me?" "Because sometimes doing the right thing means facing your past head-on." Evan's eyes held hers. "I've spent years running from what happened in the Morrison case. Maybe it's time I stopped running." Sophie struggled to find the words. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything you've worked for." "You're not." Evan's voice was sure, steady. "You're the reason I'm finally fighting back. Whatever Tom thinks he has, whatever he plans to reveal, I'm ready for it. The question is, are you ready to stand with me? Sophie looked at this man who had risked so much for her, who continued to fight despite the personal cost. She straightened her shoulders, finding strength in his unwavering resolve. "Yes," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Sophie sat in Evan's office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. The sun had set hours ago, but neither of them had made a move to leave. The weight of Tom's threats pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She watched Evan's reflection in the window as he worked at his desk, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The steady tap of his keyboard filled the silence. How many hours had he spent here, working on her case, putting his reputation on the line? "You should go home," she said quietly. "It's late." Evan looked up from his computer. "I could say the same to you. I can't stop thinking about what Tom said." Sophie turned from the window, facing him. "About the Morrison case, about the emails." Evan's hands stilled on the keyboard. "Sophie, no, please, let me finish." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together. "I've been going over everything in my head. When you first offered to help me, I was so grateful, so relieved. But I never stopped to think about what it might cost you." She moved closer to his desk, her fingers trailing along the polished wood. "Your career, your reputation. You've worked so hard to rebuild everything after what happened before. And now, because of me, it could all come crashing down again." "That's not—" "It is," she insisted. "Tom's family has been holding these documents over your head for years, and the only reason they're threatening to use them now is because of me. Because you're helping me." Her voice cracked. Maybe we should stop, before it's too late." Evan stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Look at me, Sophie." She forced herself to meet his gaze, seeing the concern in his eyes. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked, moving around his desk to stand in front of her. "I see someone who's been fighting alone for far too long. Someone who's had to be strong when she shouldn't have had to be. But your career, my career—" He gave a short laugh. "Sophie, I've spent years living with the guilt of what happened in the Morrison case. Years wondering if I could have done things differently, if I should have fought harder." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "When I saw what Tom was doing to you, how he was trying to manipulate the system, I knew I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." Sophie shook her head. "That's just it. You're putting yourself in the line of fire because you feel guilty about the past. But this isn't your fight. You're wrong." Evan's voice was gentle but firm. "This is exactly my fight. Not because of guilt, not because of the past, but because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I care about what happens to you, more than I probably should." The admission hung in the air between them. Sophie felt her breath catch. "I'm not here as some sort of penance, Sophie. I'm here because watching you face this alone?" He shook his head. "I couldn't do it. And yes, Tom's family might try to drag my name through the mud again. But this time I'm not fighting alone either." Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. "I just don't want to be the reason you lose everything." "You're not." Evan reached out, squeezing her shoulder gently. "If anything, you're the reason I finally found the courage to face my past. Whatever Tom thinks he has, whatever his family tries to do, we'll face it together. That's not a burden you're putting on me. That's a choice I'm making." The sincerity in his eyes, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder. It all felt overwhelming. But for the first time since Tom's threats, Sophie felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen. "Together?" she whispered. Evan's smile was gentle, reassuring. together. Sophie stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting her navy blazer for the 10th time that morning. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent rehearsing every detail of her testimony. The courthouse bathroom's harsh fluorescent lighting did her no favors, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the cold porcelain sink. The door creaked open, and a young intern from another law firm walked in, giving Sophie a sympathetic smile. Sophie had seen her around the courthouse over the past few weeks, always scurrying behind senior attorneys with armfuls of documents. The girl's presence reminded Sophie of herself just months ago, before everything changed. Sophie's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Evan. "Meeting in conference room B in 15 minutes. Bring the Wilson documents." She gathered her things, giving herself one final look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same person who had walked into this courthouse alone months ago. She was stronger now, even if she didn't always feel it. The courthouse hallways were already bustling with activity. Lawyers in pressed suits hurried past, their leather briefcases swinging. Court officers directed traffic, their voices echoing off the marble walls. Sophie weaved through the crowd, clutching her files close to her chest. Outside conference room B, she paused to catch her breath. Through the frosted glass, she could see Evan's silhouette as he paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. His usual calm demeanor seemed slightly fractured today. She could tell by the way he kept running his hand through his silver hair. "I understand the implications," she heard him say as she opened the door. He held up a finger, asking her to wait. "Yes, I'm well aware of what they're planning. No, that won't be necessary. I've got it handled." He ended the call with a heavy sigh, turning to face Sophie. "Good morning?" "Barely," Sophie attempted a smile. "Everything okay?" "Just some last-minute maneuvering from Tom's side." Evan gestured to the chair beside him. "They're trying to throw us off balance before closing arguments." Sophie sat down, spreading the Wilson documents across the table. "What kind of maneuvering?" "They're planning to bring up some old cases from my past," Evan said, his voice carefully neutral. "Trying to discredit me in front of the judge." Sophie's stomach clenched. "The Morrison case?" "Among others." Evan shuffled through the papers she'd brought, but she could tell he wasn't really reading them. "They're desperate, which means we're winning." "But what if—" "Sophie." Evan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Do you trust me?" The question caught her off guard. Did she trust him? This man who had stepped into her life when she needed help most, who had fought for her when no one else would, who had shown her more kindness and support than she'd known in years. "Yes," she said softly. "I do." "Then trust that I can handle whatever they throw at us." He smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "We've come too far to let them shake us now." They spent the next hour reviewing their strategy, going over key points, and anticipating counter-arguments. Sophie watched as Evan transformed from the gentle, supportive presence she'd come to know into the sharp, strategic lawyer she'd seen in court. His eyes sparked with determination as he outlined their final approach. "Remember," he said, gathering his papers, "today isn't about Tom anymore. It's not about his family or their vendetta against me. It's about justice, for you and for anyone else who's been bullied into silence." Sophie nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I just want it to be over." "It will be," Evan assured her. He checked his watch. "Court starts in 20 minutes. I need to make one last phone call. Meet me outside the courtroom?" "Okay." Sophie stood, smoothing her skirt. As she reached the door, she turned back. "Evan?" He looked up. Yes? Thank you. For everything. His expression softened. Don't thank me yet. Save it for after we win. Sophie walked out into the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Through the large windows, she could see the morning sun breaking through the clouds. In less than an hour, the final battle would begin. She watched as Evan emerged from the conference room, his briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared. She recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn the day he first walked into court to represent her. The look of a man ready for battle. The courtroom hummed with tension as Evan rose from his seat. Sophie watched him button his suit jacket, a gesture she'd seen countless times but now seemed weighted with significance. The overhead lights caught the silver at his temples, and for a moment she saw both versions of him, the compassionate mentor and the formidable attorney. Your Honor, Evan began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. Before I present my closing arguments, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence. He reached into his briefcase, withdrawing a manila envelope that Sophie hadn't seen before. Tom shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar. His lawyer leaned forward, whispering something urgent in his ear. Objection, Your Honor. Tom's lawyer stood abruptly. This is highly irregular. All evidence should have been submitted during discovery. Your Honor, Evan countered smoothly, this document came into my possession just this morning. It directly pertains to the defendant's credibility and establishes a pattern of behavior that's crucial to this case. The judge considered for a moment, her eyes moving between Evan and Tom's increasingly agitated lawyer. I'll allow it, but be brief, Mr. Harrison. Evan nodded, approaching the bench with the envelope. What I hold here is a settlement agreement from 2015, signed by Richard Palmer, Tom's father. He paused, letting the name sink in. An agreement that effectively buried a case very similar to Ms. Walker's, involving the same tactics of intimidation and financial manipulation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sophie noticed Tom's face had lost some of its color. This agreement, Evan continued, was designed to silence a young associate at Palmer & Associates who had discovered irregularities in the firm's billing practices, the same type of irregularities that led to my own departure from corporate law 7 years ago. The buzzing in the courtroom grew louder. Tom was now frantically scribbling notes to his lawyer, his usual smug expression replaced by something closer to panic. The Morrison case, Evan said, his voice cutting through the whispers, which Mr. Palmer's team has so eagerly brought up to discredit me, wasn't about my failure as an attorney. It was about my refusal to participate in the systematic fraud that the Palmer family had orchestrated. Sophie watched as Tom's lawyer jumped to his feet again. Objection. This is character assassination, Your Honor. I'm simply establishing context, Evan replied calmly. This pattern of behavior, using financial pressure, legal intimidation, and character assassination, is exactly what we've seen in Ms. Walker's case. The only difference is that this time, they chose the wrong target. He turned to face the gallery, his presence commanding the room. Ms. Walker came to this court seeking protection from a man who used his family's wealth and influence to control and manipulate her. When she refused to bow to his demands, he employed the same tactics his family has used for years: threats, intimidation, and abuse of the legal system. Tom was now visibly sweating, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide his discomfort. His lawyer appeared to be reading through the settlement document with growing concern. But unlike their previous victims, Evan continued, his voice gaining strength, Ms. Walker stood her ground. Despite having no resources, despite facing an opponent with seemingly unlimited means, she refused to be silenced. She refused to be bought. She refused to let justice be buried under another convenient settlement agreement. He turned back to the judge, his expression grave. Your Honor, this case isn't just about a relationship gone wrong. It's about power, and how that power can be abused when left unchecked. It's about whether our legal system will continue to be a tool for the wealthy to oppress those with less means, or whether it will fulfill its true purpose, to provide justice for all, regardless of their financial status. The courtroom was dead silent now, every eye fixed on Evan as he delivered his final words. The evidence is clear. The pattern is established, and the time has come for this court to send a message that money and influence cannot buy immunity from justice. As Evan returned to his seat, Sophie caught a glimpse of Tom. His face had transformed from its usual arrogant mask to something she'd never seen before. Fear. Real, unmistakable fear. He was frantically whispering to his lawyer, who looked equally shaken. The truth that Evan had uncovered hadn't just exposed Tom's actions. It had revealed the entire foundation of privilege and corruption that had protected him for so long. And now, in front of everyone, that foundation was crumbling. Sophie sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Evan continued his presentation. The courtroom remained hushed, hanging on his every word as he methodically laid out the connection between Tom's family and his own past scandal. "Your Honor," Evan said, his voice steady and clear, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit C." He gestured to the screen where a series of documents appeared. These are internal memos from Palmer and Associates, dated 7 years ago, specifically relating to the Morrison case. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confident demeanor cracking. His lawyer leaned forward, scrutinizing the displayed documents with growing concern. "These memos," Evan continued, "detail a systematic pattern of fraudulent billing practices, but more importantly, they reveal direct communications between Richard Palmer and the firm's partners about how to handle my discovery of these irregularities." Sophie watched as Evan moved closer to the judge's bench, his presence commanding attention. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the determination in his expression. "The Morrison case wasn't about my professional failure, as Mr. Palmer's team has repeatedly suggested. It was about my refusal to participate in their fraud. When I threatened to expose their practices, they orchestrated my downfall." Tom's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation." "Overruled," the judge responded, her eyes fixed on the documents. "Continue, Mr. Harrison." Evan nodded, pulling out another set of papers. These are bank records showing suspicious transfers from Palmer and Associates to offshore accounts, coinciding perfectly with the dates of the Morrison case settlements. The same pattern appears in Ms. Walker's case. Identical tactics, identical timing, identical attempts to silence opposition through financial manipulation. Sophie noticed beads of sweat forming on Tom's forehead. His perfectly pressed suit suddenly seemed to fit him wrong, as if he were shrinking inside it. "But there's more," Evan said, his voice growing stronger. "We've uncovered evidence of 3 other cases where the Palmer family used similar tactics. Young professionals who discovered irregularities, threatened to expose them, and were subsequently buried under an avalanche of legal proceedings and character assassination." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Several journalists in the gallery were furiously taking notes, their pens scratching against paper, creating a soft undercurrent to Evan's words. "In each case," Evan continued, pointing to highlighted sections of the documents, "the pattern is identical. First, financial pressure. Then, personal attacks. Finally, a carefully orchestrated legal campaign designed to discredit and silence. The same playbook Mr. Palmer has attempted to use against Mrs. Walker." Sophie glanced at Tom again. His face had lost its usual smug expression, replaced by something she'd never seen before. Fear. Real, palpable fear. His lawyer was frantically flipping through papers, seemingly searching for something to counter Evan's revelations. "Your Honor," Evan said, his voice softening slightly, This case isn't just about a relationship gone wrong. It's about power, corruption, and the systematic abuse of our legal system by those who believe their wealth places them above the law. He turned to face the gallery, his eyes briefly meeting Sophie's. Ms. Walker didn't have the resources to fight back. She didn't have an army of lawyers or unlimited funds. What she had was the truth, and the courage to stand up for it, despite overwhelming odds. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents before her with intense concentration. Tom's lawyer stood again, but his objection seemed weak, almost half-hearted. Your Honor, we object to this character assassination of the Palmer family. Noted, the judge replied curtly, not even looking up from the documents. Sophie felt a surge of hope as she watched Tom's composure continue to crumble. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, nearly knocking it over. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted dramatically, and everyone could feel it. The truth was finally coming to light, and with each word Evan spoke, with each document he presented, Tom's carefully constructed facade of power and control was cracking. Sophie straightened in her seat, feeling stronger than she had in months. For the first time since this legal battle began, she could see victory within reach. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Matthews gathered her papers, the rustling of documents the only sound breaking through the tension. Sophie sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, each beat seeming to echo in the quiet room. Beside her, Evan maintained his professional composure, but Sophie noticed the slight tension in his jaw. His right hand rested on the table, fingers spread wide, as if anchoring himself to the moment. The morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood of the courtroom furniture. On the other side of the aisle, Tom sat with his lawyer, his earlier confidence completely shattered. His expensive suit, usually worn like armor, now seemed to hang off him awkwardly. He kept adjusting his tie, a nervous tic Sophie remembered from their relationship. The gallery behind them was packed. Journalists leaned forward in their seats, pens poised over notepads. Several of Sophie's co-workers had come to show support, their presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Even Mrs. Chen from the coffee shop downstairs had closed early to attend, her usually cheerful face now serious with concern. Judge Matthews cleared her throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Sophie instinctively reached for Evan's arm, then caught herself and pulled back. He noticed the movement and gave her a reassuring nod. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Matthews began, her voice steady and clear, including the newly submitted documentation regarding the Palmer family's previous legal dealings. Sophie held her breath. The air in the courtroom felt thick, almost suffocating. She could hear someone's watch ticking somewhere behind her, each second stretching into eternity. The pattern of behavior demonstrated by the defendant and his associates shows a clear intent to manipulate the legal system for personal gain, the judge continued. She paused, adjusting her glasses as she looked down at her notes. The evidence of systematic harassment and financial manipulation is particularly troubling. Tom shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. Sophie noticed his father, Richard Palmer, sitting in the back row, his face a mask of controlled anger. The judge looked up, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Furthermore, the attempts to discredit Ms. Walker through personal attacks and financial pressure demonstrate a disturbing abuse of power and privilege. Sophie felt a flutter of hope in her chest, but she forced herself to remain still. She'd learned the hard way not to celebrate too early. The memory of previous disappointments kept her grounded, even as the judge's words seemed to lean in her favor. The court cannot ignore the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, not only in this case but in the pattern of behavior established by Mr. Palmer's family firm, Judge Matthews stated firmly. Her voice took on a harder edge. Such actions undermine the very principles of justice this court is meant to uphold. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Sophie could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, could sense the collective held breath of everyone present. She noticed one of the court reporters had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys in anticipation. Judge Matthews straightened her papers one final time, the sound impossibly loud in the silent courtroom. Therefore, in the matter of Walker versus Palmer, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Sophie Walker. The words hung in the air for a split second before the courtroom erupted. Gasps and murmurs swelled into a wave of sound. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet, "Yes," before being shushed by their neighbor. Tom's face had gone completely pale, while his lawyer was already reaching for his phone. Sophie sat frozen, the judge's words echoing in her ears. She felt lightheaded, as if all the oxygen had suddenly been sucked from the room. Relief crashed over her in waves, making her fingers tremble where they rested on the table. The judge's gavel cracked against the sound block, restoring order. The court orders immediate cessation of all harassment and legal proceedings against Ms. Walker. Furthermore, Mr. Palmer will be required to pay all legal costs incurred during these proceedings. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters clustered around the entrance, their cameras flashing like lightning in the afternoon sun. Inside the marble-lined lobby, a crowd had gathered around Evan, their voices echoing off the high ceiling. Fellow lawyers clapped him on the back, offering congratulations and business cards. A local news reporter pressed forward, microphone extended, asking for a statement about the landmark case. But Evan's attention was elsewhere. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking past the sea of suits and pressed shirts. He nodded politely at the praise but remained distracted, his thoughts focused on finding one person in particular. "Mr. Harrison, how does it feel to have exposed the Palmer family's corruption?" A reporter called out, pushing closer. "If you'll excuse me," Evan said quietly but firmly, easing his way through the crowd. He spotted Sophie's dark blue blazer disappearing around a corner toward the east wing of the courthouse, away from the commotion. The noise faded as he walked down the quieter hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the walls lined with portraits of former judges. The air felt cooler here, away from the press of bodies in the lobby. He found Sophie in a small alcove, standing before one of the windows. She had her arms wrapped around herself, as if holding herself together. The sunlight caught the tears on her cheeks, making them glitter. "Sophie?" he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, quickly wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. I just needed a minute. It's all a bit overwhelming." "You don't need to apologize." Evan moved closer, his expression gentle. "You've been through more than most people could handle." Sophie let out a shaky breath. "I still can't believe it's over. When the judge started speaking, I was so sure something would go wrong at the last minute. It always has before." "But not this time," Evan said, his voice firm but kind. He leaned against the window frame, loosening his tie slightly. The formal posture he'd maintained throughout the trial softened. "You won, Sophie. You stood your ground against them, and you won." "Because of you," she said, turning to face him fully. "If you hadn't stepped in." Her voice caught. "I don't even want to think about where I'd be right now." Evan shook his head. "I may have provided the legal expertise, but you provided the courage. Do you know how many people would have given up after what Tom put you through? But you didn't. You kept fighting." Sophie's eyes welled up again, but this time she didn't try to hide it. When my mother passed away, I thought I was completely alone. I never expected— She gestured between them. This. Someone actually being in my corner. Your mother would be proud of you, Evan said softly. I know I am. Sophie moved forward suddenly, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. Evan stiffened for a moment, surprised by the display of emotion, then carefully returned the embrace. They stood like that for a moment, the sounds of the courthouse muffled and distant. Thank you, Sophie whispered against his shoulder. Not just for winning the case, but for believing in me when nobody else did. Evan's throat tightened with emotion. You never have to thank me for that, he said, his voice rough. You deserved someone in your corner, Sophie. You always did. They stepped apart, and Sophie gave a watery laugh, smoothing down her blazer. Look at me, crying all over your expensive suit. It's seen worse, Evan said with a small smile, though usually it's coffee stains from late-night case reviews. Sophie returned his smile, and for the first time since the trial began, it reached her eyes. The weight that had been pressing down on her shoulders seemed lighter, her posture more relaxed. Through the window they could hear the distant sounds of traffic and life continuing as normal. But in their quiet corner of the courthouse, something had shifted. Something had healed. The setting sun painted the courthouse hallway in warm amber tones, creating long shadows that stretched across the marble floor. Sophie stood by the window, her fingers fidgeting with the button of her blazer, her heart racing as she gathered her courage. The victory of the trial still felt fresh, but something else demanded attention, something that had been building slowly over these past weeks. Evan, she began, her voice soft but steady. There's something I need to tell you. He turned from the window, his expression open and patient. The usual formality he carried himself with had softened in these quiet moments after the trial. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his jacket was slightly rumpled from their earlier embrace. What is it? He asked, taking a step closer. Sophie took a deep breath, steeling herself. These past few weeks, working with you, seeing how much you've done for me, it's made me realize something. She paused, searching for the right words. What I feel for you, it's more than just gratitude, more than admiration for everything you've accomplished in court. The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. Sunlight caught the silver in Evan's hair, and Sophie noticed how his hands, usually so steady, tightened slightly on the windowsill. I know it might seem inappropriate, she continued quickly, her words tumbling out. You're my boss, and you've been this incredible mentor figure, and maybe I'm completely misreading everything, but— She looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. I care about you, Evan, in a way that goes beyond everything else. Evan remained quiet for a moment, and Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. She could hear the distant sounds of people leaving the courthouse, car doors slamming, life going on as normal, while her world hung suspended in this moment. Sophie, he said finally, his voice gentle. Look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his, finding warmth there instead of the rejection she'd feared. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the subtle flecks of gray in his blue eyes. When I first decided to help you with this case, he began, choosing his words carefully. It was because I saw someone who deserved justice, someone who reminded me of why I became a lawyer in the first place. He smiled softly. But somewhere along the way, it became about more than that. Sophie felt her breath catch as Evan reached out, carefully taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding her in the moment. I found myself looking forward to our strategy sessions, not just because of the case, but because I wanted to see you, he continued. Your strength, your determination, the way you refused to give up even when things seemed impossible. It made me see you differently, made me feel things I wasn't expecting to feel. What are you saying? Sophie whispered, hardly daring to hope. Evan's thumb traced a gentle pattern on her palm. I'm saying that your feelings aren't inappropriate, Sophie, and you're not misreading anything. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture impossibly tender. I care about you too. More than I should, perhaps, but I can't deny it anymore. Sophie leaned into his touch, her eyes filling with tears of relief and joy. The tension that had been building between them throughout the trial, the unspoken moments of connection, the shared glances, it all led to this moment. Evan leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Sophie moved forward, meeting him halfway. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, soft and sweet, full of promise. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, drawing her closer, while hers came to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Evan rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing softly in the quiet hallway. The setting sun had painted the world in gold, and in that moment, everything felt possible. Sophie stood in front of her apartment window, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over the skyline. The past few weeks since the trial had been a whirlwind of change, but for the first time in months, she felt truly at peace. Behind her, she could hear Evan moving around her small kitchen, the soft clink of cups against saucers bringing a smile to her face. "Tea's ready," he called out, his voice warm and familiar. She turned from the window, taking in the sight of him in her space. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him during the trial. It still amazed her how naturally he fit into her life, how easily they'd transitioned from lawyer and client to something more meaningful. "Thank you," she said, accepting the steaming cup he offered. The scent of chamomile filled the air between them. "It's strange, isn't it? How different everything feels now?" Evan settled beside her on the small love seat, his own cup balanced carefully in his hands. "Different in a good way, I hope." "The best way," she assured him, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "I keep thinking about how much has changed since that first day in court. When Tom was—" "Hey," Evan interrupted gently, setting his cup down to wrap an arm around her shoulders. "We don't have to talk about him anymore. He's in the past." Sophie nodded, grateful for the reminder. "You're right. I want to focus on moving forward." She took a sip of her tea, letting its warmth spread through her. "I've been thinking about going back to school, actually, finishing my degree." Evan's eyes lit up with interest. "The business degree you mentioned?" "Yes. I put it on hold when Mom got sick, but—" She straightened up, feeling more confident as she spoke. "I think she'd want me to finish it. And after everything that's happened, I realize how important it is to build something for myself." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Evan said, his voice filled with pride. "And I'd be happy to help you look into programs, if you'd like." Sophie set her cup down next to his, turning to face him more fully. "You've already done so much for me, Evan. I don't want to keep asking for—" "Sophie," he cut in, taking her hands in his. "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference." His thumbs traced gentle patterns across her knuckles. "Besides, I've been doing some thinking of my own about the future." "Oh?" She raised an eyebrow, curious. "I'm considering opening my own practice," he revealed. "Something smaller, more focused on helping people who really need it. The trial reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Sophie squeezed his hands, recognizing how significant this decision was for him. "That sounds perfect for you. You have such a gift for helping people." "I was hoping," he continued, looking slightly nervous for the first time, "that you might consider being part of it. Once you finish your degree, of course. Your organizational skills are incredible, and with a business background—" "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Hamilton?" she teased, though her heart swelled at the thought of building something together. He chuckled, pulling her closer. "I'm offering you a partnership, Ms. Mitchell, in every sense of the word." The weight of his words settled between them, full of promise and possibility. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy ones. "I'd like that," she whispered. "All of it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. Sophie's mind wandered to all the possibilities ahead of them. School, the new practice, their relationship growing stronger each day. For the first time since her mother's passing, she felt truly hopeful about the future. Evan pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about?" "Just how grateful I am," she replied honestly. "Not just for winning the case, but for finding you, for having someone who believes in me." "You did that yourself," he reminded her. "I just helped you see what was already there." Sophie gazed out her apartment window, watching the autumn leaves dance in the gentle breeze. The setting sun painted the sky in warm oranges and pinks, reminding her of how much time had passed since the trial. Her fingers traced the rim of her empty coffee mug, mind wandering through the memories of the past few months. The sound of dishes clinking in her kitchen drew a smile to her face. Evan had insisted on making dinner tonight, claiming she needed a break from her intense study sessions. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the apartment, making it feel more like home than it ever had before. "Something smells amazing," she called out, turning from the window. "Just an old family recipe," Evan replied, his voice warm and relaxed. He'd shed his usual formal attire for a casual sweater and slacks, looking perfectly at home in her small kitchen. "Though I can't guarantee it'll be as good as my mother's version." Sophie walked over to the kitchen counter, watching him stir the pot of sauce. "I'm sure it'll be perfect." She leaned against the counter, taking in how natural this felt. Him in her space, sharing these quiet moments together. "How's the studying going?" he asked, reaching for the oregano. "That business law textbook looked pretty intense." "It is," she admitted, "but I'm actually enjoying it. It helps that I have my own personal legal expert to consult." She bumped his shoulder playfully. Evan chuckled, setting down the wooden spoon to pull her into a gentle embrace. Who would have thought that all those hours in the courtroom would turn into impromptu study sessions? "Speaking of the courtroom," Sophie said, her expression growing more serious, "I saw Tom's sister at the grocery store yesterday." Evan's arms tightened slightly around her. "How did that go?" "Better than I expected," Sophie replied, surprising herself with how true it felt. "She actually apologized for everything her family put us through. I think the truth coming out during the trial affected them more than we realized." "People can surprise you," Evan mused, returning to the stove to stir the sauce. "Sometimes it takes a hard truth to make them see clearly." Sophie nodded, thinking about her own journey. "I barely recognized the person I was before the trial. I was so scared, so unsure of myself." "You were always strong," Evan corrected gently. "You just needed someone to remind you of that strength." "You did more than remind me," she said softly. "You showed me how to use it." Evan turned off the stove and faced her fully. "You know, watching you grow these past months has been incredible. Seeing you tackle your classes, start planning for the future. You're amazing, Sophie." She felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "I couldn't have done it without your support. Sometimes I still can't believe how everything turned out. That day in court when you first showed up to defend me, I never imagined we'd end up here. Here being? His eyes twinkled with amusement. Here, making dinner in my tiny kitchen, planning a future together, me going back to school. She gestured around them. Being happy. Really, truly happy. Evan reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. I never imagined it either. After that scandal years ago, I thought I'd lost my chance at this kind of happiness. But meeting you, helping you through your struggle, it helped me heal too. Sophie leaned into his touch, remembering the haunted look in his eyes when he'd first told her about his past. We helped each other heal, she corrected softly. That we did, he agreed, pulling her close again. The sauce bubbled quietly beside them, filling the kitchen with its comforting aroma. And now look at us. You're back in school. I'm starting my own practice. We're building something real, Sophie finished, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, like everything about him. Something good. They stood there in comfortable silence, holding each other in the warm kitchen light. The world outside continued its usual pace, but in that moment, time seemed to slow down just for them. It was these quiet moments, Sophie realized, that meant the most. The simple act of being together, safe and secure in their shared love and understanding.